Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a topic today that I know is on a lot of people's minds: retirement. Specifically, retirement here in the U.S. We've got a really interesting mix of stuff you guys sent in. We've got the Social Security Administration's website, a bunch of articles about maximizing benefits, even a YouTube channel called The Retirement Nerds.
Retirement nerds, that's my kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a topic with so many different angles.
Yeah.
And it really is different for everyone, especially when you think about how much the whole retirement landscape has shifted, even in just the last few decades.
For sure. It's definitely not your grandparents' retirement anymore. So where do we even begin with this? Should we start with Social Security? It seems like everyone's got a different opinion on when you should take it, how it works, if it'll even be around in a few years.
You're right, it's a hot topic.
Yeah.
Maybe a good place to start is with the whole concept of full retirement age. That age when you can get your full benefits. People always think it's 65, right? Like you hit 65 and you're home free. But it's not that simple anymore, right? There's no more gold watch and you just head out the door.
Exactly. So for most of us now, depending on when you were born, that magic number, that full retirement age, it's actually somewhere between 66 and 67 for most people.
Okay, so that's a good starting point, knowing your full retirement age. But then there's this whole other layer of you can start taking benefits as early as 62, or you can wait until 70.
Yeah.
I'm seeing all kinds of different advice in these articles. There's even a video here from Financial Fastlane that says you should just start taking it at 62 no matter what. What are the trade-offs there?
Yeah, and it's so confusing because it's definitely not one size fits all. That decision when to take Social Security, it really depends on your own situation. A lot of people get hung up on what they call the break-even point. Like there's this magic age where you would have gotten the same amount, whether you started taking benefits early or if you waited. You'll see a lot of those articles. They'll say that age is around 80.
Okay, so wait, if I'm understanding this right, that break-even calculation, it doesn't actually tell the whole story.
It's way too simple. Like one thing it often leaves out is those cost of living adjustments. Those COLA increases, those can really add up over time and they can have a big impact.
So it's not just about how long you live, but how much those benefits are actually going to be worth in the future.
Exactly. And here's another thing people don't always think about, what's called the opportunity cost. That's basically, if you're not taking those early benefits and investing that money, you could be missing out on years of potential growth. Like let's say because you're delaying Social Security, you have to tap into your savings earlier, right? Well, that money that you're taking out of savings, it could have been growing for you. It really changes things up.
That makes sense. It's way more complicated than just picking an age and saying that's the best for everybody.
Right. And of course, we always have this big question mark, which is, what about Social Security in general? Is it going to be around? Every time I open a newspaper, there's a headline about it going broke.
It's definitely something people are worried about. I know I am sometimes. What's the reality? Are we all going to be eating cat food when we retire because Social Security's gone bankrupt?
Okay, so while it's true that there are some real concerns about how it's going to be funded over the long term, it's not like it's just going to vanish overnight. Even if, and this is a big if, but even if nothing changes, the Social Security Administration's own projections show that benefits would still be funded at about 80% even after that trust fund is depleted.
Okay, well, 80% is better than nothing. But you bring up a good point. What kind of changes could actually be made to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, Congress has a bunch of options. They could raise the income cap on the Social Security taxes. Right now, that cap is $160,000. So any money you make above that, you're not paying Social Security taxes on it. One option would be to raise that cap, which would mean that those higher earners would be paying more into the system.
So someone who's making, say, $250,000 a year, they're only paying Social Security taxes on a portion of their income.
Exactly. Or they could adjust how those benefits are calculated, or they could even change that full retirement age that we were talking about before. The point is, there are things that they can do, and actually, changing Social Security is one of those things that both political parties tend to agree on, so it's very likely that we are going to see some changes.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving pieces here. So far, we've been talking about how individuals should be thinking about their Social Security. But what about couples? Does it get even more complicated when you're trying to figure out the best strategy for two people?
Absolutely. It's a whole other ball game. Now you're trying to maximize how much income you have coming in over both of your lifetimes, and you especially need to think about protecting whoever the lower earning spouse is. That's where spousal benefits and survivor benefits really come in.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit.
Mhm.
What are some of the things that couples really need to understand about how those benefits work?
One of the biggest things that trips people up is that spousal benefits, they don't actually keep increasing if you delay past your full retirement age.
So if one spouse is planning to wait until 70 to max out their benefit, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other spouse should do the same.
Right. So let's say you have one spouse who's a higher earner and they wait until age 70. The other spouse who's the lower earner, they're not going to see any of those extra delayed retirement credits. So in that case, it might actually make more sense for the lower earning spouse to go ahead and start taking their benefit earlier, even if it's a little bit less.
So are you saying that sometimes taking a smaller benefit up front could actually mean more money for the couple over their lifetimes, especially if they're investing those early payments?
Exactly. And once you start adding in things like how long do we think each of us is going to live, what are our healthcare costs going to be down the road, that's when it becomes clear there's no one right answer. That's also when it can be really helpful to talk to a financial planner who can run some different scenarios for you.
Sounds like these decisions, they don't exist in a vacuum, right?
Yeah,
They have an impact on your whole financial picture.
exactly. And of course, we can't forget about survivor benefits.
All right, those are a big one. How do those work, and what should couples be keeping in mind?
Well, survivor benefits are there to make sure that the spouse who's still living has some financial security after the first spouse passes away. The thing a lot of people don't realize is that the surviving spouse, they can actually get 100% of what their deceased spouse was collecting if that amount is higher than their own benefit.
Oh, wow, I had no idea it was the full amount. That could be huge.
Right. It can be a real lifesaver, especially if the higher earner was also the one who was expected to live longer. And this is where it gets really interesting. There's this strategy that some couples use where the lower earning spouse actually files for their benefits early, even though it's reduced, while the higher earner delays.
So they're kind of giving up some money now, but potentially setting things up so that the surviving spouse is in a much better position later.
That's the idea. And there are a couple reasons why this can be a smart move. First, it gives the couple a little bit of extra income right away. But even more importantly, it lets that higher earner's benefit keep growing, which means the survivor benefit for the lower earner is going to be bigger too.
It's like building in an extra layer of protection.
You got it. And again, this is where talking to an expert who really understands Social Security can make a world of difference. They can help you run the numbers, see what makes sense for your situation, and make sure you're maximizing your benefits.
This is already so much to think about. It's definitely not something you want to try to figure out on your own.
You're telling me. And speaking of complicated, we haven't even gotten to Medicare yet. That's a whole other set of decisions.
Oh man, don't get me started on Medicare. Just looking at the Medicare website makes my head spin. We definitely need to unpack that one.
We do. But maybe we'll save that for part 2 of our retirement deep dive.
Okay, so we tackled Social Security, but now we got to talk about Medicare. I have to admit, even just seeing the word Medicare on all these pamphlets, it kind of freaks me out. There are so many parts and deadlines and enrollment periods. Where do we even start?
It's definitely got a reputation, right? Like it's this big confusing thing. But really, at its heart, Medicare is there to provide healthcare coverage for people who are 65 and older and some people with disabilities. And the key is, just like we were talking about with Social Security, to break it down into smaller pieces.
Yeah, let's make it digestible. So what are the absolute basics that everybody needs to know about?
So you'll hear people talking about Part A, Part B, Part C, Part D. It's like building blocks. Part A, that's your hospital insurance. That's what covers you if you have to be hospitalized, if you need to go to a skilled nursing facility, or you need some home health services.
Okay, so Part A, that's what kicks in if, God forbid, something serious happens and I need to be in the hospital for a while.
Yep, exactly. Part B is more like your everyday kind of coverage.
Yeah.
Doctor visits, screenings, lab tests, things like that.
So the stuff you'd be using to manage any chronic conditions you might have and just for your regular checkups and things.
Exactly. Now, Part C, that's where it gets a little different. Part C is called Medicare Advantage, and that's actually run through private insurance companies, not directly through Medicare. It's basically they bundle up your Part A and Part B coverage, and often they'll throw in some extra benefits that regular Medicare doesn't cover.
Oh, like what? What kind of extra benefit?
Oh, things like dental, vision, sometimes even hearing coverage, that kind of thing. Some of them will even give you a gym membership.
Wow. Okay, so with Medicare Advantage, it's almost like I'm choosing to go with a private insurance plan instead of going through the government.
That's a good way to think about it. It really gives you some choices. And then there's Part D, and that's the prescription drug coverage.
Okay, yeah, Part D, I knew that was coming. That one seems super complicated.
Yeah, and that's another one that's run by those private insurance companies, not directly by Medicare. and they'll help cover the cost of your medications. But the thing is, it really varies from plan to plan. The medications they cover are different, and how much you pay is different, so you really have to do your homework.
It sounds like research is key. With all of this, it seems like the more information I have, the better choices I can make.
Absolutely, 100%. Knowing what your options are is the best way to save money and just have peace of mind, so you're not caught off guard later.
One of the things that I was surprised to see in all this research is that Medicare and traveling abroad, that's something retirees need to be thinking about. I always just assumed Medicare would cover me wherever I went. I even saw this whole YouTube video about it, something called the Medicare Coach. He was talking all about how to navigate Medicare if you're traveling overseas.
Yeah, that's a really common misunderstanding. Sadly, traditional Medicare, it usually doesn't cover you if you're outside the US. There are a few exceptions, like if it's an emergency and you're close to the border with Canada or Mexico. But in general, yeah, you're on your own.
So what are my options if I'm picturing myself, finally retired and I want to travel? I can't really rely on Medicare to cover me.
Well, one thing you can do is if you have traditional Medicare, you can look into what's called a Medigap policy. It's also called a Medicare supplement, which I think is kind of confusing. But anyway, some of those Medigap policies, they do have coverage for if you're traveling in another country. Usually it's not unlimited, like they'll cover a certain number of days and that's it.
What about those Medicare Advantage plans? Do they ever cover you if you're traveling internationally?
That's a great question, and more of them actually are starting to include at least some coverage for international travel, but you really have to read the fine print.
So just because they say international coverage, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm fully covered if something happens while I'm on that trip to Europe.
Yeah, unfortunately, that coverage might be very, very basic, or it might only apply in really specific situations. So that's where it's important to do your research. No matter what kind of Medicare plan you have, if you're planning a big trip, especially if you're going to be gone for a long time, it was always a good idea to get some travel health insurance.
And I would imagine medical evacuation is a big one too, especially as we get older.
Oh, absolutely. Those medical evacuations, they can be so expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars, easy, even hundreds of thousands to get you back home if something happens while you're overseas.
That is scary.
Yeah.
It makes you realize having that extra insurance, it's not just about being extra cautious, it's really about protecting yourself from potentially huge expenses.
Exactly. When we're thinking about our health in retirement, it's not just about, oh, do I have Medicare, Part A, Part B, all that. It's about thinking ahead. Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? And do I have a plan?
Right, it's all about having a plan. So we've talked about Social Security, we've talked about Medicare, but there's another big piece of this retirement puzzle. Retirement accounts, like 401k, those seem to be everywhere. Are those still the gold standard when it comes to building your nest egg?
I'd say they're definitely a cornerstone. It used to be that everybody had a pension and that's how they funded their retirement. But these days, it's much more common to have a 401k. And, when you're thinking about building wealth for retirement, they're amazing, especially when you factor in the fact that your employer might match your contributions.
Right, it's free money. Don't leave that on the table.
I know, right? But you'd be surprised how many people don't take full advantage of that. It's essentially free money that's just being added to your retirement savings. And another great thing about 401ks is that usually you have a lot of different investment options to choose from.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, you'll usually have a mix of mutual funds, ETFs. You might even have what are called target date funds.
Okay, target date funds, what are those?
So those are basically designed to, as you get closer and closer to retirement, they automatically adjust, how your money's invested, how much risk they're taking.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like a set it and forget it thing?
Pretty much. It takes some of the guesswork out of it for you. But of course, it's always good to have at least a basic understanding of how your money is being invested and to make sure it lines up with your overall goals for retirement.
Right, because everyone's situation is different. And even if it seems hands-off, it's still your money and your future. So you want to have some idea of what's going on.
Exactly. And speaking of retirement, there's this other really important question. How do you actually use that money once you're retired? It's not as simple as just cashing out your 401k and calling it a day.
Oh, I bet. I imagine there are some pitfalls there, things you don't want to do if you want that money to last.
Absolutely. You've worked so hard to build up this nest egg, you don't want to blow it all in the first few years. That's where having a plan, a withdrawal strategy, is really essential. You want to find that sweet spot where your money is going to last, but you're also able to enjoy it, right?
Makes sense. So how do we even begin to figure that part out? What's the first step in creating a sustainable withdrawal strategy for myself?
Well, you'll hear a lot about something called the 4% rule, but like most rules of thumb, it's not perfect and it definitely doesn't work for everybody. But it's a good starting point.
Okay, so we're back, and I'm ready to talk about this whole withdrawal strategy thing. Like, we spend our whole lives saving for retirement, but then how do you actually make that money last once you're retired?
It's a really good question, and it's something that a lot of people don't think about until it's almost too late. Like you said, you spend all this time building up your nest egg, but then you need a plan for how to actually use it. And like I mentioned before, a lot of people will throw around that 4% rule, but it's not a magic bullet. It's a good starting point, but it's not for everyone.
So remind me again how the 4% rule works.
Basically, it says that in that first year of retirement, you can withdraw 4% of your total savings. And then each year after that, you adjust that amount up a little bit to keep up with inflation. So if you had $1 million saved up, you could take out $40,000 that first year.
Okay, that makes sense. But you're saying that doesn't work for everyone.
Right, because it's based on a lot of averages, like average market returns, average life expectancy. But everyone's situation is different.
What are some of the things that might make someone want to adjust that percentage up or down?
Well, your health is a big one. If you think you might have higher than average medical expenses in retirement, it might be smart to be a little more conservative, maybe withdraw a little less each year.
That's a good point. Healthcare costs can really sneak up on you.
They really can. And another big factor is just your risk tolerance. Some people, they're okay with a little more risk. They're comfortable with the idea that, hey, maybe my money runs out, but I'm going to enjoy it while I can. And then other people are like, no way, I need that security. I need to know my money is going to last.
So it's about finding that balance between enjoying your retirement and also making sure your money's going to last. Are there other strategies other than the 4% rule that people can use to manage their money in retirement?
Absolutely. There are a bunch of different approaches, and it really depends on what makes you feel comfortable. One that I really like is called the bucket strategy.
Buckets, like sand buckets.
Well, not exactly, but it is a good visual. So imagine you're taking all your savings and dividing it up into different buckets, and each bucket has a different purpose.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So you might have like a short-term bucket for things you know you're going to need to pay for right away, and then a long-term bucket for stuff that's further down the road.
Exactly. So you might have a short-term bucket for your everyday expenses, maybe a mid-term bucket for things like vacations or home repairs, and then that long-term bucket for, later in retirement when maybe you need more help with healthcare or something.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It seems a lot less overwhelming than just having this big pile of money and trying to figure out where it's all going to go.
It's all about making it feel manageable, right? Another option that some people really like is something called an annuity. Have you ever heard of those?
Yeah, I've heard of them, but I'll be honest, I'm not really sure how they work.
It's definitely one of those things that sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, with an annuity, you're giving a chunk of money to an insurance company. And in exchange, they promise to give you a certain amount of money every month or every year for a set amount of time or even for the rest of your life.
So it's kind of like creating your own pension, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. It's about having that predictability, knowing that no matter what happens in the market, you've got that guaranteed income coming in.
That's really appealing. Are there any downsides to annuities?
Well, like anything, there are some things to be aware of. They can sometimes come with high fees, and there's always the risk that the insurance company itself could have financial problems, though that's pretty rare.
So again, it's all about doing your research.
Exactly. Don't just jump into anything without understanding what you're getting into. And speaking of things we've talked about, remember those target date funds? A lot of them actually have a payout option, so you can use them for income in retirement too.
Oh, that's right. So you could potentially have that one investment all the way through retirement and then use it to generate income later on.
Exactly. It's like a built-in withdrawal strategy. But again, it's always good to stay informed and make sure it's still the right fit for you as you get closer to retirement.
I'm realizing that this is a lot to take in, but it's really important stuff. What's the most important piece of advice you'd give to someone who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this? Where do they even begin?
That's easy. Just start. Don't put it off. Even if retirement feels like it's a million years away, the earlier you start thinking about this stuff, the better off you'll be. And you don't have to do it alone. Talk to a financial advisor, get some advice, make a plan. That's what they're there for.
Don't let it turn into one of those things you just keep avoiding because it seems too complicated.
Exactly. Retirement should be something you're excited about, not something you're dreading.
This has been so helpful. We covered so much ground today, but I think the big takeaway is it's never too early to start planning for retirement. And it doesn't have to be scary. There are people out there who can help you figure it all out.
100%. Retirement's not about just not working. It's about having the freedom to do what you want when you want. And having a good plan makes that so much easier.
I love that. So as we wrap things up here, any final thoughts for our listeners out there who are ready to start planning for their dream retirement?
Just remember, retirement looks different for everyone. It's about figuring out what's important to you, what you want your life to look like, and then make a plan to make it happen.
Well said. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. It's about figuring out what works for you. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.